This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. The impacts of extreme weather from climate change brought 4 tropical storms and flooding to parts of Connecticut last summer. This summer, our state is experiencing drought conditions. And last week, the governor declared a moderate drought for New London and Windham counties, indicating dry conditions have impacted local water supplies, agriculture, and ecosystems. This is a Stage 3 drought, which hasn't been declared in the state since October 2020. But the eastern portions of these counties are in an extreme drought, according to the U.S. Drought Monitor. Today, Where We Live, how is the drought affecting agriculture and wildlife? Coming up, we hear from Long Island Soundkeeper Bill Lucey about how weather extremes caused by climate change negatively impacts habitats for fish populations, like brook trout. First, we wanted to check in with local farmers. Joining us now on the phone is Hannah Tripp, owner and manager at Provider Farm in Salem, Connecticut, on the eastern side of our state, where officials again have declared a Stage 3 drought. Hannah, welcome to our show.
Hi, Lucy. Thanks for having me.
I wish we were talking under better circumstances. Our listeners can join as well, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Hannah, I mentioned the federal U.S. Drought Monitor saying that far east portions of our state, in the county that you're in, are in extreme drought. So can you describe the changes you've noticed on your farm this summer?
Yes. So I would say that the most obvious is in our irrigation ponds, obviously. Our main irrigation pond is probably 2 feet below its normal level. We're lucky it still has water in it. I know other area farmers who are out of water, but this is definitely the lowest I've ever seen it. And the drought really, we're about 10 inches below average for the year in terms of rainfall. But for this stretch from the beginning of July until this week, when we actually got a little bit of rain on Monday, we were 5.5 inches short just for that month and a half. So that's pretty severe.
What do you grow at Provider Farms? And given the conditions you're seeing now, and then all that flooding from last year and all the rain, what decisions have you had to make?
Right. So we grow diversified vegetables mainly, which means we grow a little bit of all kinds of vegetables that you'd see in a farmer's stand or at your supermarket. So for us, because our irrigation systems aren't set up permanently, we rotate crops every year, and we just don't have permanent irrigation systems. So we are manually moving sprinklers over most of our 15 acres to water our crops, and we just can't keep up. We just can't physically move them fast enough to get everything enough water. So for us, we've had to make hard decisions about prioritizing certain crops over others, which has been difficult.
So can you give us an idea of the crops that you made a decision not to grow because of the conditions?
So, we haven't chosen not to grow anything. It's just that there are certain crops that are not going to survive under the conditions. So for us, it's been mainly fall crops that get planted early in the season, like potatoes, winter squash, sweet potatoes. Those crops just got neglected in July because we do a whole nother round of fall planting of broccoli and cabbage and carrots, and we prioritized the newly planted crops because they just wouldn't make it without water.
What are some other challenges in the extended heat wave and less precipitation? Have you noticed more scavengers about the farm impacting your crops as well?
Absolutely. So it's definitely been one of the worst wildlife seasons I've ever seen for us, really across all aspects of our farm. So we had earlier this month, we found that there was a bear and then coyotes in our watermelon field just ravaging the melons. And then we also have had a groundhog in our greenhouse where we start all our own seedlings just take out multiple successions of late fall brassicas like broccoli and kohlrabi and also lettuce that are going to definitely have a big impact on our farm, later on in the season.
What are you hearing from customers?
We are lucky. Our primary business model is a CSA, so we have CSA members who buy in for the whole season, and we communicate with them regularly with a weekly newsletter, and they're very supportive and understanding for the most part. But I do think that in general, people who aren't working outside or with food don't always understand the impacts that the weather is having and aren't always aware of the weather patterns that we're experiencing. And so it's important to sort of communicate with your customers about what's happening.
This summer, definitely different from last year when there was so much rain and also flooding. And I think that was your first year as owner and manager of the farm. So I'm wondering, and Provider Farm in Salem. So can you talk about, the experience of that and how you're preparing when we think about these extremes that farmers have to think about for the future?
Yeah, so it's definitely been a tale of two seasons for sure. Like, really couldn't have been more different. Last year at this time, we had fields with standing water and, eroded gullies down the middle of beds. And this year, before this rain we got on Monday, it was a dust bowl just blowing our topsoil around everywhere. So there were a couple decisions that I made over the winter about where to plant certain things based on which fields did well in the wet year last year that I would certainly like to take back, because the driest fields last year were our best, and this year they're really struggling. But that's the nature of farming as well. So at least going into year 3, I've certainly seen a little bit of everything.
You're a lifelong resident of Salem, and I believe you've been working at Provider Farm for at least a decade before taking over. And so when we think about the changes farmers are seeing broadly, when we think about how the seasons are fluctuating or just variability, what do you want our listeners to know?
So for me, just in the decade plus that I've been farming, I feel like the biggest changes I've noticed are the seasons seem to be shifting later. Even from when I started farming back in 2012, I would come to the farm after my college semester in May, and it would be hot. Almost always, not for the entire month, but for a few days here and there. And now the last 4 or 5 years, I'd say it's frequently cold and rainy into June. And on the other end, we'll have hot summer weather deep into September and sometimes even October. So that's something I've noticed. And then obviously, just as any climate change, is just the intensity of the weather and the weather patterns. Storms are more rain all at once. Droughts are, more intensely dry without any sort of mitigating water. Heat is more, cold is more. So that's very challenging for growers to have to deal with the variability and the intensity.
Connecticut's a small state, and I'm sure many farmers around Connecticut. What are you hearing from them? Or are they worried about their futures?
Absolutely. I mean, it's certainly a very uncertain time to be trying to grow food. I think, like I said, I know several farmers in the area who've actually run out of water, who've had to delay plantings and had, even more severe impacts than we have. So it's definitely scary.
You're hearing Hannah Tripp, owner and manager at Provider Farm in Salem, Connecticut. It's part of the state where officials have declared a stage 3 drought condition, and federal officials say that's extreme drought, the eastern parts of New London and Windham counties. You can join us, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. For another perspective, with us now on Zoom is Chris Bassett, co-owner of Killam and Bassett Farmstead in South Glastonbury. Chris, welcome to our show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You're able to hear a little bit of Hannah's experience. And so what have you and your family experienced this season?
We're right there with Hannah and her farm, same exact issues. It's detrimental every year. We always have issues, or I shouldn't say detrimental, but these last couple of years. But the one thing that we always remember, farmers are the biggest gamblers in the world, because every year we never know what we're going to deal with. And weather is always such a huge part of that.
So south of Glastonbury, I believe the state sees that as a stage 2 drought zone, so emerging drought. You're still experiencing a lot of the dry conditions. So I know last year we had talked with another farmer, sub-edge farmer and owner, Roger Phillips in Farmington, who told us, they'd invested thousands on drought infrastructure like wells and irrigation back in 2020, only to be flooded out last summer. And so did you have a similar experience where you're planning for one thing, and then it's a complete flip in the other season, and you're left scrambling?
Um, it's a crapshoot every year. So we didn't plan whether this year was going to be really wet, even with the weather we had last year. We did our normal, like we plant down by the river last for our crops. We have 93 acres. So what we do is always try to plant up on the hilly sides just because it's a drier in general. But again, trying to keep in mind that we have to be able to have access to irrigation depending on what we're planting there. And like Hannah, you have to pick and choose what you're willing to forego. Like we started a new crop of ground cherries this year, wanted to give a go at that. And a few other new crops that weren't as big or as, knowing that they're not as well received by our customers, those were where the sacrifices had to be made.
And what have you been hearing from customers, Chris?
A lot of customers are very sympathetic, but a lot of them still have to be educated because a lot of them think it's like walking into a grocery store, which the grocery stores nowadays are not as supplied as they used to be. But I have people in our CSA who we post once a week on social media to show what we're giving to our CSA customers, but it's not the same every day. And a lot of our customers think, well, on Monday, if they got apples, how come I didn't get apples on Thursday? And it's literally, I walk in there in the morning and see what they've gone and picked. And depending on how much we have of each item, it's just that re-education of the customer to let them know that we can't walk into a warehouse, grab what we need, and just put it in the bags for them or on the shelf.
Well, when you think about your future on the farm with your family and, some of the decisions you've had to make, I'm wondering if you can, talk about some of those conversations you're having, the adaptations that you either put in place or may have to in the future to keep going.
We're always looking for that new technology or a better way to do what we already do. Ironically, a lot of the old school, what has worked for 50 plus years, is still how we do things because it's the best way to do it. But if there is a new way to do irrigation that is cost effective, that is the huge thing with farmers, is what's cost effective. And whether we're planning to save our money little by little each year to invest in a better irrigation system, or this year what we ended up doing was buying fire hose from the local fire department because they were switching out their hose and there was nothing wrong with the hoses that they had. And we got them cheaper than we would have gotten if we bought used 4-inch irrigation pipe. Wow. So to get them up the hill and in, sneaky little areas, it was a lot more flexible and worked out really well. So our planning is always putting aside money to improve what we're doing. But again, just trying to make sure it's better for the future generations of our kids coming up.
Hannah Tripp is still with us from Provider Farm in Salem. I'm wondering if you can chime in, Hannah, when we think about some of the adaptations or, some practices that have worked for a while that are helping you now through this drought.
I think that everyone, like Chris is saying, we're all thinking about how we can improve and going forward. And I think a big part of that is going to be probably more indoor tunnel, not indoors, but in tunnel growing. It's a lot easier to control water and temperature and shade cloths on tunnels than it is in the open field. So I think that's something that's going to be a big part of growing moving forward in this area.
And how is using plastic mulch helping you?
Yeah, so for us, we grow mainly the hot summer crops on plastic mulch, which allows us to irrigate using drip tape instead of overhead irrigation, which is a semi-permanent system. It moves every year, but you can set it up once for the season, and then it's a lot less labor to keep watering that crop. So there are several crops that I'd like to move towards that, just so if we have another dry year, we're a little bit more set up to irrigate more regularly.
Chris, we heard her talking about indoor tunnels or shade cloth. Is that something that's been helping you as well?
In our greenhouses, yes. We've moved to shade cloth just to make sure what we're growing now from seed is good to go in a couple weeks or depending on how many weeks we need it to put it out in the field. And where before we'd have to plant directly out in the field, and that was not an option this year.
I understand, Chris, at Killam and Bassett Farmstead, you're also farming tobacco. I live up in Suffield, Connecticut, so I'm seeing those tractors out now getting the leaves to dry in the barns. Can you talk about your crop and how it's sensitive to this climate change that we're discussing?
Sure. It's actually, the tobacco crop is one of the hardiest ones out of between the vegetables and fruit that we do to the tobacco. And irrigating is the most key thing for it, but it likes the dry, hot, humid weather. So the one issue that we do have is if we go this long of a length without any water, it can get stunted or shocked. And then a 3 to 4 foot plant of tobacco ends up being 2 to 2.5 feet. So you don't get as much production off it in the end.
So not as much production this season, but you'd said that this is definitely hardier than some of the other crops that you've been growing for some time.
Yes, and compared to last year, where when it's raining, all you can do is sit there and we get too much water. All you can do is sit there and watch it. And this year, at least we can do something about it. Takes a lot more work for us. But irrigating every day for the last month and a half is better than just sitting there like last year and watching it rain for weeks on end, and then dealing with the aftermath of the disease and the rot and that type of items that you end up having problems you have after so much rain. And so what summers, there's less that you can do versus the dry conditions you're experiencing now. Correct. Neither one is ideal, but we would prefer the drier year over the wet year, because we would go out last year and pick winter squash, pumpkins. They look fine, and within 2 to 4 days, they just start rotting. And the concern becomes, if you sold that to a customer, they brought it home and it doesn't last for them. We want the best product for our customers, and there was just no way to regulate that other than trying to hold on to it a little bit and see how it did on our own.
You've been hearing Chris Bassett here on Where We Live, co-owner of Killam and Bassett Farmstead in South Glastonbury. Chris, thank you so much for talking with us. And when you think about the end of the season, when is that traditionally for you?
Our produce goes until New Year's. So we have everything, winter squash, Brussels sprouts, all the fall crops, cold crops, up through, it actually goes through January. So our end of the season is not until then.
Well, we wish you the best. Thank you so much for coming on to tell us about what you've been experiencing. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Hannah Tripp is still with us, owner and manager at Provider Farm in Salem, Connecticut. Again, extreme drought in parts of those New London and Windham counties. Hannah, I understand you also have cows, and so I'm wondering, the impact on, taking care of them in these drought conditions.
Right. So we've definitely seen a huge impact in our pasture quality. We have a very small herd, definitely less than the carrying capacity of our pastures, which is good. But there are pastures that just aren't regrowing the way they normally would, and they're completely brown and dead at this point, which is just really sad to see.
And so, are you bringing in hay from other places, or how do you move forward with that?
Right. Well, because our carrying capacity is greater than the number of cows we haven't had to bring in hay yet. We do expect we'll have to start feeding out hay significantly earlier than we normally do. And I know we're lucky we have a good hay supplier. We should be all set for the winter, but hay supply is going to be significantly impacted by the drought locally as well.
And what does that mean for cost?
Well, feed costs have been going up anyway, but the drought is definitely only going to exacerbate that, especially if you're trying to source local feed and local hay.
Well, Hannah, thank you for, again, coming on the show as well. Hannah Tripp, owner and manager at Provider Farm in Salem, as we talk about how agriculture, also wildlife, impacted by drought in our state. Hannah, we appreciate your time.
Thanks so much.
You're listening to Where We Live on Connecticut Public. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. After the break, we're going to hear from the state agriculture commissioner about how the drought is just compounding these challenges facing local farmers. What questions do you have? You can join us, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR, or share a comment on Facebook. Find us on Twitter at Where We Live. You're listening to Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Now, scattered thunderstorms are in the forecast today, but that's not enough to help drought conditions in our state, especially in eastern Connecticut. Parts of New London and Windham County is experiencing extreme drought. Now, Fox 61 meteorologist Rachel Piscatelli reported 11 inches of rain would be needed to quench parched Connecticut, but also noted, quote, "We don't want that all at once. Instead, spread over a period of days. And if the drought persists for another month or so," Piscatelli says that need could nearly double to 19 inches of rain needed. Now, we just heard from local farmers about what they're experiencing. Joining us now on Zoom is Connecticut Department of Agriculture Commissioner Bryan Hurlburt. Commissioner, welcome back to the show.
Lucy, thanks for having me and for dedicating some time and the program to this important story.
Our listeners can join as well with questions, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So respond to what we've heard from Hannah and Chris and just their struggle from, again, last summer, too much rain, this summer, not enough.
Yeah, well, and kudos to Chris and Hannah for making time to share their story and doing such a great job explaining what this means for them, their farm, and their business operation. Nobody can tell that story better than they can. I was recently out at an event, and somebody said, "Well, is this to be expected? Is this the drought going to be the norm?" And I said, "Well, remember, last year we had way too much water." And so, what's to be expected is you can no longer expect anything. As Hannah said, she was, moving her crop rotation based on what she thought would happen. And so, the challenges in a changing climate just create and compound the challenges that we face in Connecticut agriculture. But what I'm very proud of is that these farmers continue to plant, continue to try, to continue to adapt, and make sure that Connecticut consumers have access to these great products.
It was interesting to hear, Chris, from the South Glastonbury farm, again, Killam and Bassett Farmstead in South Glastonbury, saying that, with these dry conditions, it's almost better than too much wet because you can't do anything if it just keeps raining. We think about the rotten disease.
Well, and to the sense of optimism, I was talking to a farmer probably a week and a half ago now, asking about his irrigation pond and his wells. We kind of got through that difficult conversation, and he smiles and he says, "Well, the good news is, no pest pressure this year." The fact that he can still be thinking about, the positive side. But yes, when it's dry and you have access to water and you get some regular rain, not like this, the crops are a lot easier to manage. You can refresh your wells and your ponds. You don't have to irrigate everything, and your disease and pest pressure is usually a little bit less. And so that is, you don't want too much water, but some is the sweet spot.
Let's talk about irrigation. So for those farmers, especially on the eastern portions of eastern Connecticut, if their water sources are drying up, where do they get the water? And talk about the cost associated there.
Well, it is a cost, and people, we could just kind of take for granted that we have water. You turn on your faucet and generally you have water. But when you're trying to make sure you have enough water for a dairy farm, your needs are significantly different. So a number of these operations do have relationships with local water companies, and they literally haul in tanker trucks of water for their animals to make sure their animals have access. I know a farm down in New London County, they were on city water at their farm stand, and they were filling their cubes to take out into the field, and we're hand watering acres of crops because that's what is needed to be done in order to make sure that their crops are available for customers. That's their investment, as you heard from Chris and Hannah. That's their investment. That's what they have to sell. So they need to make sure that they have a crop at the end of that season to recoup their costs, to keep their business going, and to keep their customers coming back.
And for those who have livestock, we talked with Hannah briefly about hay and fewer cuttings, less feed for animals, more cost compounding there.
Yeah, well, and right now, dairy farmers are chopping corn. That's something you usually don't see until October-ish. Maybe late September, early October through the month of October. They chop their corn to create silage to feed their animals over the winter. They're chopping their corn now because the nutritional content, the volume of the corn just isn't there. So there's no point in keeping it out in the field. Well, that means lower yields, lower nutritional content. They're going to have to be buying in feed. As Hannah mentioned, there's not a lot of hay out there. Everybody's corn crop is going to be light, and so these farmers are going to have to be paying more and hauling more in state than we've traditionally had to do in order to make sure that they have enough feed for their animals to get through the seasons.
So, what can your department do to help these local producers, Commissioner?
Well, there's a couple of things. We just received acknowledgement from Secretary Vilsack, literally while we're on the call here, that Windham and New London counties are declared a disaster. And so that opens up some USDA Farm Service Agency emergency loans. It opens up the opportunity to reconfigure loans that folks have that are government backed. It also opens up the opportunity for crop insurance type payments. As we all know, we can't control the weather, but what we can do is better prepare the land for this changing climate. And in a few weeks, we'll be rolling out through the GC3 proposal to create and have available climate smart agriculture funds, where we'll be making grants to farmers, nonprofits, and other organizations to help farmers with that transition to implement more climate smart technologies, practices on their farm. As Chris and Hannah mentioned, there's a cost to do those things, and we want to help offset that cost so they can implement those practices and be prepared for whatever next year brings.
Again, you're hearing the Commissioner of the Department of Agriculture, Bryan Hurlburt, here on the show as we talk about how the drought is impacting agriculture and local producers. Commissioner, you mentioned this disaster declaration, and so what do local producers need to know in terms of accessing that federal help?
Yes, they should call their local county farm service agency office. New London County is in Norwich, Windham is in Brooklyn, and let them know that they experienced losses and what their losses were and what crops they had. And that will help trigger those emergency payments. If they have a loan, they can call the Norwich office and ask to reconfigure it or ask what other provisions are available. If you don't have a loan through the USDA, but you're worried about being able to pay your bills, you can try to get or apply for an emergency loan to help cover those costs through these challenging times. These are some great programs, and it's important that people are aware that they exist and have the opportunity to take advantage of them.
We were thinking about how farms in our region have been impacted. We know Rhode Island's been hit particularly hard. Vermont Public Radio, they were talking to apple farmers up there and how less rainfall could mean a lot of less apples. And so I'm wondering, thinking about the fall crops, right? The people that are looking forward to the apple picking, the pumpkins, what are you hearing from farmers who have these crops?
Well, the fruit is certainly lighter. The fruit will be smaller, and so if people want that, that oversized apple, you might not see that as often out there. There's a lot more fruit that's dropping that the trees just can't support the fruit, and the stems dehydrate, and the weight of the fruit makes it fall to the ground. So there'll definitely be smaller fruit, maybe less fruit. But the plus side is that the fruit will generally be sweeter. So you'll get a more intense flavor of that pear or apple or peach, or, if people are still picking blueberries. And that's, there's a little bit of a different experience there. And that's why stories like today and our partners in the media highlighting these challenges are really important. So customers know what they're going to be walking into, and hearing from Chris and Hannah and other farmers, they know what their expectation should be, and how important it is that they still go out and support their farm and do the pick your own or visit the farm stand or sign up for the CSA. So that's really important that we can help set those expectations.
When we think about just moving forward and the irrigation systems that farmers have, Connecticut public reporter Kay Perkins spoke with Dr. Wong, who's a UConn professor of environmental engineering, a fellow of the American Meteorological Society, talking about this rain deficit the region's experiencing, saying it will take several major rain events to replenish the severely depleted surface and subsurface storages. So can you talk more about that from the farmer's perspective, the water sources that they rely on?
Yes, and like you mentioned at the beginning of the segment, we certainly don't want to get those 11 or 15 or 19 inches of rain, in a day or two. That's not going to help the situation. But what we do want is some good, steady rainfall and some good snow over the course of the winter to refresh the aquifers, the irrigation ponds, people's wells. And that'll be helpful. One of the things that we can do and farms can do is put a cover crop on their fields through either the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service or potentially through this Climate Smart Ag program that we'll be rolling out. That increases the organic content in the soil. That helps the soil retain some moisture. So in these prolonged droughts, you'll have, the shorter rains we have or the limited rains we have, that moisture will stay available to the crops for longer. On the flip side, like last year, when you have too much water, it actually helps the water drain through the soils. So it's not creating runoff or washing out into gullies or ditches and taking that topsoil with it. So it's really beneficial to implement some of these practices for a lot of reasons. But again, there's a cost, and we want to help people manage that cost so that they can put that practice into place.
Later today, you and farmer Hannah Tripp, who we spoke with from Provider Farm in Salem, will be joining Senator Richard Blumenthal and Congressman Joe Courtney. So again, you just mentioned that the Ag Secretary, Thomas Vilsack, declaring parts of New London and Windham counties a disaster declaration so that farmers, local producers can get some federal assistance. So will you be talking more about that there or requesting other things, Commissioner?
We'll be talking more about that there, continuing to raise the message and let people know that this is available, continuing to share the story just like we're doing here. But also we're pursuing a statewide declaration. We want to make sure that the farmers out in the Northwest and Southwest corners have access to these programs as well. I was out with Congresswoman Hayes and Deputy Secretary Jewel Brana on Wednesday out to Freund's Farm in the Northwest corner. And they're, dealing with the same challenges of the drought, not necessarily as significant as some of our Eastern Connecticut farmers, but they have challenges as well. And we want to make sure that the federal assistance is available to them, just like it is to their colleagues on the eastern side of the state.
Well, thank you again, Department of Agriculture Commissioner Bryan Hurlburt, here on Where We Live. We appreciate your time.
Thank you, Lucy. Appreciate the opportunity.
Now, coming up, we're going to talk more about how extreme weather caused by climate change impacts local wildlife, including fish. Are you a local fisherman? What have you observed this summer fishing in Connecticut's waterways? We're going to hear from Long Island Soundkeeper Bill Lucey right after a short break. You can join us too, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Now, the extended heat wave this summer, paired with not much rain, led state environmental officials in early August to close fishing near tributaries to the West Branch, Farmington, and Farmington rivers. Those closures are still in effect. Deep Commissioner Katie Dyke says trout in these rivers were suffering from heat stress because of high temperatures and low stream flows. And the fishing closures in these spots were meant to lessen the stress on trout to avoid increased mortalities. We want to talk more about how extended heat waves and less rain has impacted local fish species. Joining us now on Zoom, Bill Lucey, Long Island Soundkeeper. Welcome back to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Listeners can join as well with a question, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. And so when we talk about drought, how does that impact freshwater and saltwater habitats, Bill?
Well, the closures on the Farmington are indicative of why we have to be really concerned about this. If you look back over the last 3 decades, we've lost 75% of our native trout, our native brook trout. When I was a kid growing up, every summer I would go down and catch trout in a little creek called Comstock Brook, which flowed into the Norwalk River. And I remember going back there in 2016 when I moved back to the state, and it was essentially dry. And there were no trout in the section that I fished. And so it was a huge concern. And then going down to the Norwalk River itself, it was actually dry. And I'd never seen that in all the years growing up down in Fairfield County. So what happens first before it goes dry is the water heats up. And we have around 4,000 or more dams in the state, and the water can get very hot behind those impoundments and then spill over. And brook trout can last in 77 degrees Fahrenheit water for a short period of time. But if it goes on day after day, like we've been seeing this summer, they're going to die. So I think that's probably what's driving the decline of brook trout in our state, is just this gradual, continuous warming of our climate.
And what about along the coast? What are you seeing? Reports of fish kills?
Yeah, we're definitely seeing fish kills. We get calls every year, but this year it's been scattered about because there have been thunderstorms in some areas that have cooled things down a little bit. But what happens is when you have hot water, it holds less dissolved oxygen. And there'll be a little bit of oxygen in the bays and harbors, the nooks and crannies of the Sound, and Manhattan or Bunker will go in there. And if they get cornered by bluefish or striped bass, that elicits a stress response. They ball up. They have a heightened sense of fear, and they'll defecate. They'll breathe faster, and they can deplete that oxygen, and then they die. And we also see a natural fluctuation between the daytime when all the plankton's making oxygen, just like all plants do through photosynthesis. So there's oxygen during the day, but at night it drops way down. And that's a lot of where we see these low oxygen readings. And we have called the Unified Water Study. So we have monitoring going on in 40 bays and harbors in New York and Connecticut throughout the Sound. And that's when we see these big dips during the hot weather, typically July and August, when we see those fish kills.
Well, you mentioned plankton, and so when we think about even the ecosystems that fish depend on for food, again, the warming waters brought on by climate change, I'm wondering if you can talk more about, the fact that this is not good.
Yeah, well, forage fish is a big topic for our organization, Save the Sound, and that's why we remove a lot of dams. And forage fish, herring, blueback herring, alewives, river herring, sand lance, all these small fish you see out there, they need to eat zooplankton. And I was just out doing some research yesterday with a researcher from Dr. Oster from Mystic Aquarium, and we were discussing how the size of plankton has been shrinking, and that's due to this persistent warming of the water. And I've also read papers from some of the local researchers. We have a great group of scientists monitoring the Sound on both the New York and Connecticut side, and the copepods, which are their zooplankton that feed on the plankton, are also shrinking. So just like we heard about the apples shrinking, I've noticed that on my little farm. The raspberries are tiny, but they're very sweet. you have less abundance potentially, and then the amount of energy for these forage fish to feed goes up for the amount of food that they're getting. So you're really starting to see these cascading effects from the hot water that stresses the entire food web, really, from the bottom up.
Mm. When you talk about the hot water in Long Island Sound, like typically, what has been the temperature that's concerning you, Bill?
Well, the magic number, the one I've been looking at closely is 77 degrees or 25 degrees Celsius. That seems to be a limiting factor for eelgrass. And we've lost well over 100,000 acres of eelgrass in Long Island Sound, and we're working on some efforts to restore that. But we have to pay very close attention to the temperature so we don't put efforts into areas that are going to get too hot and kill off these restoration efforts. So, I on the Great South Bay, on the other side of Long Island, I heard it hit 80 degrees where there was some eelgrass restoration going on. That's really warm. And you can see it. We saw it with the lobster die off. A few degrees, it gets warmer. You really put pressure on the existing matrix of fish that are out there. We're seeing a lot more black sea bass. You have to be careful when it's hot, when you're sport fishing for, say, striped bass, because it's very stressful for them for catch and release. It takes them longer to revive. There's a whole... It's going to be very different in 30 years from what we're seeing today. And actually, someone caught a cobia, a giant cobia, this week.
I saw
in
that.
Long Island Sound. So,
Connecticut Fish and Wildlife shared a picture, and I wanted to ask you about that because I saw comments from local fishermen about, they've been here, but the idea with warming water, are we going to see more cobia, Bill Lucey?
Yeah, it's kind of like when I was a kid, once in a while you'd see a black sea bass. Now you can't keep them off the hook when you're out there jigging for porgies. So, we're going to start seeing more. They're trigger fish. I mean, the Gulf Stream has always gone by, and we've always gotten strange fish coming in here, but the frequency and abundance of them is definitely going to go up. But on the flip side, what's been going down are river herring, and that's the connection between the inland freshwater and the saltwater. And these are extremely important fish for everything from ospreys and eagles that like to catch them to feed their nestlings in the spring, to striped bass, bluefish, and everything out in the Sound that we like to go after. And Eric Schultz is a professor at UConn, and he's got a lab right now that's doing a project, Can They Get Out? So we do a lot of effort removing dams to open up spawning and rearing habitat for these river herring, which are severely depleted in Connecticut from their historic numbers. And when we get these droughts, he's looking at, can the fish get out? So let's say they have a great spring, we get a good run, and all the fish go up and spawn, and then they go back out to sea. Their eggs are still in the gravel, and as those young fish hatch and are trying to make their way back to the sea, if there's no water or they're getting cut off by low water, is that just wiping out the entire stock for that year? So that's something that the Schultz lab is looking at right now.
You're hearing Bill Lucey here, Where We Live, Long Island Soundkeeper, as we talk about how extreme weather and changes in temperature, the water, are impacting fish in our area. You can join us with a question or comment, 888-720-9677, impacting their ecosystem that they rely on as well. Christine in Killingly, you had a question. Go ahead, Christine.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. So I don't know if Mr. Lucey would be the person to talk with us about. My brother is a trout fisherman up here in the Quiet Corner, and he has been keeping copious notes for probably 15 years about what he fishes for, the day, the temperature, where he fishes, what kind of bait he uses, what kind of fish are biting, and that type of thing, the weather. And he caught 169 trout this year. He just catch and release. His last one was a trophy fish at 5 pounds, 7 ounces, 23 inches. And I wonder if this documentation might be valuable to someone.
Bill, Lucey, do you have any?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's only so many people working for the agencies, And there's only so many scientists. And really, that's how we rely on getting data out of Long Island Sound. We have over about 24 citizen groups or community science groups. So what I would do with that information is I would share it with Connecticut Deep, their fisheries division. Tim Wildman is one of their biologists that we work frequently with. Because then you can look at trends over time. I mean, that's how a lot of the records of climate change have been recorded, say in Europe. They go back well over 100 years, people looking at the first, blooms, when the bees first show up, when this fish species first shows up. And that's a pretty big, it sounds like your brother's been doing pretty well with the fishing this year. One thing I will say about dams, if they're bottom release dams, they can release cold water into the streams. And that's what we really need as we see all this development, loss of riparian buffer areas, basically trees shading the rivers. The dams can actually be used to manage to save some of those trout during these really dry, hot conditions.
And Christine will be sure to share your information with DEEP, which is the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection Fisheries Department. So hopefully we can connect you with them. Before we run out of time, Bill, we just have a couple of minutes for listeners who have been listening. When we think about, what we can do in the short term as well as the long term, we know the key is, cutting emissions to help dull this impact that we're seeing from climate change. I'm wondering if you can talk about the federal law and how this may help and what more we can do.
Well, we just passed a scaled down version of Build Back Better, I guess, the climate bill or the Inflation Reduction Act, and it's fairly loose as far as the solution. So we need all of the above. We need to reduce our carbon emissions through the transportation sector. We need to make our homes energy efficient. We need to use less water. We need to potentially change our diet to look at crops that aren't so hungry for water. We have to do absolutely everything. And the bottom line is we've got to start taking this climate change issue seriously. There's not a lot of denial left, but for many years that slowed the solutions down. And, it's like the Yankees and the Red Sox fans, fighting it out. It's like, we need to stop that. This is a problem that's facing all of us. And we really need to work together as a society, both a global community and as our nation, to really address these issues aggressively.
Again, you've been hearing Bill Lucey here on Where We Live, Long Island Soundkeeper. Bill, thank you for your time. Are you going to try to catch a cobia now?
I'm going to go this weekend with some buddies, yeah.
We appreciate your perspective on the show.
Thank you.
And as we heard earlier from Agriculture Commissioner Bryan Hurlburt, the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture Thomas Vilsack declaring New London and Windham counties as designed by the federal agency as primary natural disaster areas due to the recent drought. We'll continue monitoring this, and we hope that you join us on Monday for a conversation about the upcoming gubernatorial race. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today's show produced by Katie Pellico. Special thanks to Katie Tolarski today. Have a great weekend.